Very good afternoon, everybody, and a warm welcome to this, the third half day of the RLI conference. For this year's conference, the theme is Improving the Global Refugee Regime from Theory to Practice. And for this sixth annual conference, we're really delighted to welcome such a wide range of participants from all across the world, across 18 different panel sessions and 3 keynote sessions. For those of you who haven't been following us the previous 2 days, we've had a very, very wide panoply of discussions all across the thematic focus for this year about how the global refugee regime might be improved, where it needs some tweaking, how that might be done, who should do it, etc. We've also had a very wide range of open panels on topics that cover almost every aspect of the displacement spectrum. For today's final half day, we end up with 3 thematic panels and 3 open panels. The 3 thematic panels are Afghan evacuations, considering how evacuations work as, if you like, a supplementary point of the refugee regime. We also have a panel on non-penalisation as a building block for reform of the global refugee regime, and finally a thematic panel on the future of complementary pathways, a very topical issue at the moment, especially in light of the Global Compact on Refugees. Our open panels for today look at asylum in a late sovereign world, considering non-independent territories and how refugee law plays out there. We'll also have an open panel looking at chain externalisation in EU migration policies, and the last of our open panels will be on alternative forms of protection in Africa. That will round off, as I say, a very rich texture of debates and discussions over the last 3 days. These have included, of course, the launch on the very first day of the Refugee Law Initiative Declaration on International Protection, dealing with questions of externalisation and asylum. If you haven't seen that yet, then I highly recommend taking a look at the RLI web pages where that first declaration can be found. Our keynotes thus far have addressed some important questions around how we deal with reform of the refugee regime. We started on day 1 with Alex Aleynikov talking us through the idea of an arc of protection. How far have we moved along the arc of protection in really providing protection and assistance to people who are displaced and need that protection? And where might we reform the system in order that it better serves those who need protection? Our second keynote by Jane McAdam considered the issue which has recurred in numerous panels and debates across the conference over the last couple of days about what about people who are displaced in the context of disasters and climate change. Is there a need to reconfigure the refugee regime, or rather, as Jane McAdam suggested, instead just clarify how refugee law as it exists applies to these situations, and instead be thinking more laterally about wider frameworks that might be used to facilitate mobility in the context of disasters and climate change. This leads me on to our keynote speaker for today, and I am absolutely delighted to welcome to the stage Sana Mustafa, who is the Director of Partnership and Engagement at Asylum Access. Sana Mustafa is a movement leader in the forced displacement sector and a human rights activist fighting against systems of oppression in Syria and around the world. After being forcibly displaced by the Assad regime, Mustafa led the establishment of global efforts for the representation and inclusion of forcibly displaced persons, such as the Global Refugee-Led Network. She's currently at Asylum Access, where she's leading the organisation's journey towards realising refugee leadership, and she's responsible for fundraising and partnership initiatives that bring together refugee-led organisations with institutional non-profits. With that background, you'll appreciate she is ideally placed to address the topic of refugee leadership and the future of the global refugee regime. So I will hand over to her in just one moment. If I can just remind everybody that our keynote will be talking for something in the region of a half hour. Whilst she's doing so, please do pose questions in the chat function. If you can address them to everybody rather than just to the host and panelists, then everybody will be able to see the questions. Once the presentation has finished, I will trawl through the questions and I will ask them in rounds to our guest Keynote for responses, discussing the debates and questions that you've raised. Without further ado then, allow me to pass over to our guest Keynote. A very, very warm welcome to the RLI conference, Sana Mustafa.
Thank you so much, David, for having me, and thanks for the School of Advanced Studies and University of London also for inviting me, and for everyone who's here for tuning in. I know this is the last day, so if you've been attending for a while, the last 2 days, I appreciate you showing up for this as well. And I appreciate also the space, David, for us to talk about this important topic right now around refugee leadership and the future of refugee regime. And just to clarify, I guess I would disclaimers before I start. And so as David said, I am Sana Mustafa. My personal pronouns are she and hers, and I work at Asylum Access. I am not a historian because I will be sharing the things. I am not a historian. I am a person who has experience for displacement and been forcibly displaced by the Assad regime. And I am someone who strives constantly to question my privilege, my existence, my role in life and the movement and how I play it. So I am part of a movement, of a community, and I have not arrived to anything I will be sharing with you alone. I have only arrived to those reflections and those learnings in a community, and especially now in my Asylum Access community. Also, another thing, I don't have all the answers. Myself, I'm still learning and unlearning and reflecting. So I'm just sharing here few learnings and reflections. And also another disclaimer, it's whatever I'll be sharing here. Some of it might feel uncomfortable for some people. And my immediate disclaimer, it's not about you or your intentions. We're talking beyond intentions. I'll be talking about the impact of good intentions in our sector. So it's not about you or me. The way I would like to address the topic of refugee leadership, and if I may, actually, I'll take a step even back, the umbrella of localization refugee leadership. I will be talking about it through sharing with you a bit of my own journey in advocating for refugee leadership since 2016 until today, and integrating this into involvement with the institutions, the Asylum Access internal journey, and where we at in the sector right now. And just one thing on definitions. I know this is a conference that with lots of people with legal backgrounds, and I'll be talking about refugees and the way I and Asylum Access, when we're not representing people for the right for asylum or certain legal rights, the way we talk about refugees, or we use the word refugees alternatively with the word persons or people of forced displacement. And with that, we mean anyone who self-identifies as a person of forced displacement, regardless of their legal status, or all of those terms. And I say that because we think about our terminology, and terminology does matter. And we see persons of forced displacement as a terminology that is inclusive, humane, puts people first, and it also recognizes that it was never a choice. It is a forced displacement. It actually includes everyone from regardless of their legal status or border structures, from IDPs to climate migrants to stateless people, and it's inclusive. So that's when I say refugees. That's how I define it, and Asylum Access define it. So I want to make that clear before I start. And with that, I would like to start with a bit of my background and how I come to this. So as David mentioned, I was born and raised in Syria, and I was born into a very political family that was living under an oppressive dictatorship for 40 years during our lifetime, and the Assad regime has been in power for a bit over 40 years. And so I have lived first experience alongside many Syrians. What does it mean to lose your rights? And I have actually grew up in a state of not having my rights and enjoying them. And I've always spoken up, demanding that alongside my family. And in 2011, when the Syrian revolution started, my family and I were from the first to take over the streets and demand freedom, democracy, and state of law for all Syrians. And we paid very high price for this. My father actually has been forcibly disappeared by the Assad regime for 9 years as of tomorrow. And my mother, my sisters, and I have been forcibly displaced, all across the world, actually. And we've been dealing with different asylum systems. All that to say, when I arrived myself to the US, and I was seeking my own asylum, my own political asylum, I was shocked. I was completely shocked because I had never actually left Syria before I was 22, and never in my life left Syria. And I thought, like, you know, US democracy, rights, human rights. And I arrived to the US and I just started like facing the realities, right after right, being deprived. The first was my shock with the US asylum system, just of how intrusive the process is, how inhumane, and then no support is provided to anyone who's actually in that process. And so that was my first shock. And I have lots of reflections about the process itself, the application, and the cost of it, and all of that, and how you even reach that. And then after that, my experience was with actually trying to do something about my own rights as a person who has become suddenly a refugee, a person of forced displacement. And this was my really kind of like real shock back then as well, is that I thought that I will be in, you know, I won't be in a place where I will still be demanding basic rights, such as like, oh, can I have an opinion? Can I be part of shaping my own life? And I found out that I was definitely again deprived of that right by every single institution or structure in the refugee displacement sector. In our very much for refugee regime, I remember in 2015, I was invited to a panel at the peak of the refugee crisis, what Europe called. And I was invited to a panel to attend in the audience to literally listen to 3 white people who are experts in the refugee regime to talk about what does it mean to be a refugee and what is the solution. And there was no representation whatsoever of any people with proximity, whether people who have their lived experience of forced displacement directly or people in local communities. It was people who were representing multilateral institutions and NGOs who knew better, who knew the solution better. And I was shocked of, you know, it was like having a panel on women's rights without women. And I was like, what? I was naive. And I was like, what? Basic rights. And I went up to the organizer and I said, I'm curious, like, what were you thinking? Like, what was your point of view? Don't you think there's a point of view, not even a central point of view? There's a point of view that's missing. And, you know, there's always then the excuses of like, oh, we don't know those people. How can we reach those people? And all different organizational excuses for not being inclusive. Or it wasn't my intentions. And again, that's why it's not about the intention. And this is when I decided, no, we are not, you know, I lost my home, my father, and my country for speaking up in a country that's really risked your life to speak up. So I am speaking up in the US, and I am speaking up globally against the systematic exclusion of persons of forced displacement in our very own affairs. And that led me to starting all what I can do in my own effort. I started doing with using my voice to shape the narrative and to reclaim the narrative. So I started doing lots of advocacy alone and storytelling across the US and globally to really talk about very basic rights, the right for self-representation. Self-representation is one of basic human rights. And until now, I always say my message is very basic and simple. I'm demanding the right of self-representation. And after that, I have also realized that, you know, I can't do it alone, and I shouldn't be doing it alone. I remember in Syria, for us, it was working in a revolution meant working with people, coordinating with other people. So I have worked with other persons who've experienced forced displacement from across the world, and we came together, and we had so many shared similarities in terms of our lived experiences, but also our struggle for the right for meaningful participation and self-representation. And that was in 2016 when we came together and we're like, let's do something about it. And we started engaging, and we formed the Network for Refugee Voices, and then the Global Refugee-led Network. And through all different platforms, or self-organizing platforms for the movement, we were engaging with many multilateral institutional actors like UNHCR and even government. And I remember very much in 2017, I was in Geneva, and the demand for refugee leadership, refugee self-representation was very new. it has always been there, but it has started, becoming a bit louder, but still not really a prominent topic. And I remember very much talking to someone at UNHCR who's very senior person, and I'm literally talking about the topic, the basic right of self-representation. And, the very simple answer was like, this is a very complex topic. Good luck to you. And he was right. It was good luck to me, and it's complex not because it's complex, because we are dealing with inherently systematic racist systematic structures. And I think that's what led me to the importance of identifying the disclaimer that it's okay, we have to admit the history of our sector. We have to admit how, on what structure UNHCR and UN agencies are constructed, with the best intentions for seeking people rights. And I always reference, in the moment in history in 1948, when they were trying to put together the Refugee Convention, is that the states that actually had a weight, and we're talking about definitions and who is the convention going to cover, were mainly actually colonizer states, and the states who refused and went into debate for a year about who's going to govern were decolonized or recently decolonized states. And the push from most of the states who were colonizer at the time is for the Refugee Convention to only cover refugees from and within Europe, which is not a surprise considering how the system reacted now to refugees from Ukraine. They literally acted as they've always wanted to define refugees. And it took the states like Mexico and Egypt and Pakistan at the time in 1949 to push back for a year on making sure that the definition of who the convention covers includes refugees all around the world. So for any of us to not admit where is our sector rooted, I will mention examples of how these dynamics still manifest currently in our sector, but there's why to not admit? I think there is power in acknowledgement, and because acknowledgement means we are moving toward justice and rectifying all this power imbalances and changing the way it's happening right now. And that lead me to in that journey of advocating for refugee self-representation and refugee rights, that conversation started picking up, I have to say, and that was around the time of the Global Compact on Refugee. And as a global refugee-led network, we engaged with UNHCR, or we pushed to engage with UNHCR throughout the consultation process leading up to the Global Compact on Refugee and the GRF to push for the agenda for refugee leadership and refugee meaningful participation. It was a very difficult process to constantly have to demand to have a seat on the very table that's about you. And I think it's very much still there. And I think many people criticize the movement of like, okay, you keep talking about self-representation. Well, like, let's talk about, the other things that comes in forced displacement. I'm like, when I stop fighting to be on the table, I would love to start talking about all other things that really concerns us as well. But regardless of that, there were lots of internal champions in these institutions that start, advocating with us and pushing, and that led to the pledge, launching the Global Refugee-led Network, GRN. We launched the Refugee Participation Pledge, and actually a number of actors have signed up on this pledge. And after that, UNHCR itself, I have to say, they have been taking steps towards supporting and empowering refugee leadership, whether through the pledge itself, whether through currently the Innovation Award for Refugee-led Organization designated some amount of money. And so I would say even now, we can talk about localization. This is all under the umbrella of localization. And I think as we start talking about localization, I want to mention the definition that UNHCR uses for localization. So the way UNHCR defines localization is that it's a process of recognizing, respecting, strengthening the independence of leadership and decision-making by national actors in humanitarian action in order to better address the needs of affected populations. And I will be talking a bit more about this, what's the problematic things around this definition. But this is the current definition UNHCR uses, and the refugee regime as a result uses. And as I said, there has been efforts in really as part of the bigger umbrella of localization, there have been efforts for to push for refugee leadership. As I mentioned, the pledge, one of them, the Innovation Award by UNHCR is one of them. Even if we want to go a bit back, the World Humanitarian Summit in 2016, it was really about making a push for donors and international actors to support localization. And they made a commitment of 25% of humanitarian funding to go directly to local and national organization, and also through the grand bargain. And so absolutely, I would say there has been global efforts towards realizing this version of localization. What I want to take us right now is actually to reflect on those things, to reflect first on the definition, and then to reflect on why these current efforts have not realized, actually we have not realized the 25%, and why they have not been sufficient in actually realizing localization since 2016 until now. And then we'll address the definition itself. So I think one of my reflections on the definition of UNHCR of localization is that I'm going to share in that the way I understand localization and refugee leadership. The way I understand it, localization should be the process of shifting power. It's shifting power, not only recognizing, respecting, and strengthening. It's about shifting power and dismantling inherently exclusive systematic structure that prevent people with lived experience of forced displacement and those around them with proximity to those issues like national actors. So not only national actors, it's about persons of forced displacement. So it's about the process that helps to shift power and dismantle the systems that prevent those with most proximity to really lead the movement of refugee rights and to shape their very own lives. And this is important because I believe, and we at Asylum Access believe, that movements led by those most affected are most likely to be transparent, legitimate, accountable, and ultimately impactful. We will be addressing when women rights movement led by women, when Indigenous rights movement led by Indigenous people, when Black Lives Matter led by Black people. Those movements are successful, legitimate, impactful, and they address root causes. They don't address needs. They address rights that really gives agency to people. They don't address only humanitarian rights. And I think this is a huge difference. I mean, I would totally push our colleagues at UNHCR and those who are working on localization to adopt a more inclusive definition, to really think and reflect about a definition that addresses the root causes, why first we have to even have an agenda on putting people, affected people in leadership position, and then dismantle those structures and then think about why this is important. And we're not saying that, I mean, my invitation here, it's not to check a box in your DEI journey as an organization, because this does not lead to anywhere. This is really do the work and reflection to understand the importance of it. And as I said, reflect on other movements. No movement has been led by other actors that succeeded. And I would say confidently, 70 years in the refugee response sector, we still have people without basic rights, refugees without basic rights in the camps with billions of dollars. We must have been doing something wrong. If it was a business case, we would totally be stop investing. Let's look at someone else to invest in. But somehow we don't dare. I dare. So many people, we're just, this is normalized. We don't question. This is always the same dynamics, money going to the same actors who are popping money to local organizations in the best case scenario as implementers, who are really focusing on humanitarian and emergency needs, not delivering them with dignity, even those, and neglecting refugee rights, and really oppressing people who have been oppressed and fled oppression. And this is why we need to think of localization as a right itself, and is a movement. And a movement cannot be exclusive. And currently it is exclusive. And as I said, regardless of the many efforts and the words that the sector has been saying around localization, besides, I think first, we're not succeeding because we're not starting from the right definition to start with. And then secondly, I would argue that the reason that we're also these efforts and these goals are not being realized by international actors is that the disconnect between dominant actors' commitment to localize and uplift refugee leadership and the reality that actually so many of those very same actors remain unwilling or unsure even how to give up power and control and visibility and space. And this is rooted in our sector, colonial past, and ongoing structure of racism. And so there is power in acknowledgement. Everyone wants to skip again that part and just be like, okay, how are we going to do it? Or stop saying, stop calling out, the problems in our sector, because as if we get over it, it gets solved. And so I think we have to just, be comfortable, all of us, in challenging the systems that we've been participating in and benefiting from. Because where we headed and where the world is in 2022, I mean, if we look down the road, I think as Sana, myself, I want to be on the right side of history. And we know very much those who did not stand on the right side of history back in the days in Africa and other places, companies, organizations, there has come a time when they have been questioned and called out. And I think now, with all the history and the documentation, this is the right time for us to question and to reflect and to change. And if anyone says, I think so many, if all the examples that I have given from my own lived experience and current ways in the system that we are still functioning in a racist system, I'm happy to give you more examples. Let's take a look. It flows, how the money flows right now. Mainly still flows from colonial power countries to formerly colonized regions. What terminology we use when we talk about refugees? We mainly use passive terminology, capacity building, all painting non-white population and refugee population as they lack capacity. Beneficiaries, as if you're not taking a salary to work on my rights, or beneficiaries or passive recipients of aid. There is until now focus on fluency and how you speak and how you present yourself, white dominant professional culture. Pay scales, privileged foreigners over local staff. How are we going to talk about localization when we send all the expats and we pay them way over the local staff to do exactly the same work? And this is still a reflection of racist and sexism in our sector. We want to talk about programs and policies, again, being focused on humanitarian and emergency response versus giving people agency and rights, basic rights. Another example would be the funding. We can talk statistically speaking, despite our best intentions and those very global commitments that I have mentioned, we estimate that only around 1% of the $30 billion in the global humanitarian funding is going directly to refugee-led organizations, 1%. And so it's really again, it's not about the intention of our sector. As I say, they were struggling to give up power and struggling to really realize those goals. And because of this very same thing I said, we're not addressing root causes. We just want to skip the huge part that happened, still happening, and we want to focus on the future, and not even in a dignifying way with the right people and in an empowering way. Does that mean all of us this way? No, I know there's so many organizations and individuals in the sector who have been doing better, absolutely. But you know what? I think there are two arguments around that. It's important to show examples, and I said, I am not here as Sana and as Asylum Access if it wasn't for the so many donors who we've pushed and they have listened and learned and now going on their journey, and they're supporting this very important work and recognizing their role in doing that. And we would not be here if it wasn't for the so many peer organizations who are also doing the same learnings and doing all of that. And these examples are important, but I'm very careful for us to use the exception to really trick ourselves that so much progress has been done. And it's important to acknowledge that there has been progress done. And it's important, again, to acknowledge the efforts that have been done on the global. But I think, especially right now, where the UN Global UNHCR consultations now in June that just happened in Geneva with the theme of localization and climate action, I am very careful now that it's a trendy topic. And what's very important is that when those things become trendy, is that so many people, they could seem like they are on that journey by talking about it, but actually not doing it, the actions. And that's why I think where we are in the movement of refugee leadership and refugee rights is accountability. I want to see how you are doing that. I want you to hold me accountable, and I want to hold you accountable. I want to understand that I don't want to only know that you are doing. You have launched an innovation fund for refugee-led organization. I want to see How's your application process is inclusive? What language you're using? Which communities you're working on? Who is in your organization actually representing those communities? Who are working on those communities? I don't think of any, I think we are lacking in our sector the approach of the what, the who, and the how. We only focus on the what, and we never succeed by focusing on the what. The how matters and the who matters, because they lead to actually address root causes, not because they are only equitable and moral and ethical and the right thing to do, but because they're also impactful. And so unless we acknowledge all of this, we are not headed on any really rooted change that would lead for people like me and many other people of forced displacement, who the numbers are only increasing, having rights. So what does that mean for you? That means there are things you can do. There are so many things you can do. And for us as individuals and as institutions, and I say Asylum Access, we have been on our own journey for the past 2.5 years. We are an institution and a global organization that's actually founded in believing in proximity and refugee rights. So we are founded in 3 national organizations led in Mexico, Thailand, and Malaysia. And we fight for refugee rights, the right to work, the right for asylum, the right for representation, and to release from detention, the right for healthcare, and for the right for education. So we are foundationally an organization that believe in rights-based approach being really the approaches that address root causes. However, Asylum Access, despite again our best intentions and our questioning, we have in the past 3 years, we stopped and we like what we're doing wrong. Our what alone again doesn't matter, and our who, even with it being our national organization being locally led and run, is not enough. There's another layer to be unpacked. There's something that we're not doing, and this is when we stopped about what about the very much the people who have the lived experience of forced displacement. Where are they at in this part of the equation? And what is our role as also a global organization that is mainly white-led, was at the time, and you registered in the US, have a privilege and have access in many ways, especially comparing to local actors and refugee-led organizations. And that led us to launch our own commitment as a board and as staff to realize refugee leadership internally, in our leadership, in our board, in what we do, and who we are, to really become part of our DNA, and to bring others along with us on this journey, to challenge the system and the institutions around policies of exclusion, and to make sure that everyone knows that they have a role. And let's figure out together, how are we going to achieve this goal together? So I'm going to mention a few examples of things that we have been doing. And I would invite you also to think about on this journey, ongoing journey. Again, we're not there yet. We don't know it all. The few of those examples, we launched our DEI journey, where we have been versing ourselves as individuals in the organization and as leadership, and all our teams, and bringing others again with us in power dynamics that's presented in our sector, the history in our sector. We have been investing in refugee leadership, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I have to say, this is not what we are doing, is not another corporate DEI journey. I'm not saying that. When people always ask me how do you think about realizing refugee leadership, especially internally, I say you have to launch your DEI journey, but no, more than this. Yes, because we never launched a genuine, because have you thought about what actually a DEI journey entails? A DEI journey entails literally looking back at those roots and histories that we talked about. It entails educating ourselves in trauma-informed engagements. Do we think about how we engage with local actors and all those around us? No, I mean, the sector, our partnerships are not trauma-informed at all. We have to assume knowledge and expertise by those with most proximate versus coming from top down and being we know better. Recognize and adapt to cultural differences. I mean, we all, probably lots of global, expats, they do all organizations, they would have some trainings. But again, those are trainings that set by the very same institutions to perpetuate the very same power dynamics, by saying actually be neutral, be distant, not be personable. And these are all the opposite of culture, of who we are, of trauma-informed partnerships. And so that's why this reflection on, it's very important, reflection on how much you're gatekeeping. All INGOs gatekeep funders' connections. What do they give local organizations? Local organization, as I say, it's still in the best case scenario implementers getting drips of the money. And they don't have the connection, the access to the donor. We still get keep connections. Once we dismantle that, then this is part of our journey on doing that. Considering joint funding equal joint funding. Where here I'm talking about what we have learned at Asylum Access, and now we have launched guidelines around, and we call it building equitable guidelines for building equitable partnerships with local organizations, and I put them in the chat. This is just a documentation of what we've learned throughout our journey of best practices and lessons learned through engaging with so many people from the movement, from refugees, local actors, DEI consultants, about what does it take, what that journey takes to really build an equitable partnership with local organization. And so all of that to say, I'm moving towards the end of it. Do you have a role? Absolutely. Does that mean, because every time I talk about refugee leadership, somehow I have to assure people that it's not about you, and it doesn't mean we're excluding you, we're calling for excluding you. No, at all. What we're saying here, there's a movement, and this movement have been co-opted by those who have not been really, by those who are living the movement, leading it in their day-to-day, and it has been systematic. What we're saying, this movement, it has actors, and they're leaders of those movements. They should be in their leadership position, and there should be allyship, true allyship. And I think this is where it comes for me about how in our sector, in the refugee response system, we are very far from intersecting with other movements, like the decolonizing aid movement, decolonization movement. How we like, again, it stays in some conversations. If we intersect, if we think of the feminist movement, if we think of Black rights movement, LGBT, women rights, decolonizing movements, if we intersect, we're not demanding in the refugee rights movement anything that is actually extremely different. This is another movement that's demanding to be led by the people who have the lived experience, and is asking for the allyship, the true allyship and support of everyone around this experience, meaning government, multilateral institutions, UNHCR, INGOs, national actors, academia. Every single person has a role. It's about, I think, before you act, it's about what is your role? What is your added value? What is your role? How do you want to play it? And how is the way you play your role is actually shifting power. It's actually addressing root causes. It's giving people rights. It's working with them. And how it's, again, empowering those who with the lived experience to really take leadership and agency over their own very lives. And so this is the question that I want you, all of us, to continue to take forward as we go. Think about your role, your added value. Think about the what and the how and the who. And let's remember that refugee representation and leadership is a right. It's like any other basic right. And we need in our sector to really talk with other movements, because you know what? They have been doing it. We're behind. We are absolutely behind. But that's also good, because there are answers. There are answers, and there are ways to do it, and there are tools to do it. And now in our sector, there are organizations, donors, because I know everyone is worried about what about the donor and where the money would come from, from Hilton Foundation to Open Society Foundation, now with the Canadian government, even with USAID, and with Global Wellbeing Fund, Bosch Foundation, Porticket, all of them literally have paused and doing those internal reflections and doing also the external reflections and result around refugee leadership and their ways of working. And so it's not too late, but in few years, it's gonna be too late. Thank you.
Many thanks indeed, Sana. That's a fantastic talk to round off our series of keynotes for the conference. And I really like the fact that you were able to bring such personal passion to the issue. And clearly you've gone on a long journey and thought deeply about these issues. I can't think of anybody better to really address the conference on this very topical theme. As you rightly said, that there is a good deal of interest, I think, these days in the theme of refugee leadership and refugee participation. And a panel yesterday, for example, was looking at that explicitly, and perhaps you joined the conference for that. But certainly it's one of those things that attracts a great deal of interest. And I suspect we'll have a lot of questions, and I'd just like to take the opportunity again to remind people to put a couple of questions in the chat. We've got a few there already, but we should have 20 minutes or so for further questions. I very much like this idea that you have of thinking about persons of forced displacement as a form of identification. And, clearly, I think that opens up doors to thinking constructively in all sorts of ways about the kinds of problems that you've identified. And I suppose my question to you would be, clearly there's a core to that concept, which is quite self-explanatory. But, persons of displacement speaks to an experience, doesn't it? It's not, about your religion or the color of your skin or any of, the gender that you assess, etc. It's about an experience. And I wondered, do you include within persons of forced displacement, or those, who've got lived experience of forced displacement, for example, the children of refugees? Do you include people who work with refugees? Do they host communities, for example? Quite often in international agency discourse, we're increasingly talking about displacement affected communities, right? And I just sort of, I wondered to what extent how your concept overlaps with that, or is it something really quite different from that? So I'm just going to, I hope you'll allow me to pose a couple of questions, abusing my privilege as moderator whilst others put their questions into the chat. So that's my first one. And if you could unpack a little bit for us what that concept means, I think that would help a lot of us to try and, really work, as you say, with this challenge that you've made to us. What role do we have in it? I think it would help us to understand how we situate ourselves in relation to that very much. One of my other questions is, I find it really, really interesting the way that you've been able to engage with the global level. I mean, clearly, work with refugees, on refugees, around displacement takes place at a number of different levels. And, working within asylum access, that as well as anybody else, and of course your own experience too. I suppose my question is, having been, it sounds like, quite successful in opening the door at the global level for refugee leadership, what do you think the prospects are for refugee leadership in national processes, and how does refugee engagement get reflected there? I mean, is it, a refugee political party? Are we talking about the political process? Because, in the UK, for example, how does money get allocated? It gets allocated by a government who's elected in. One of the big problems we have in our sector in the UK, I'm sure in the US too, is that there's an unwillingness on the part of some political parties to engage fundamentally or deeply with refugee questions. How do refugees assert leadership in those sorts of contexts? That would be, or persons of forced displacement, whether refugees or having some other relationship to that concept. And I suppose my last question is, having diagnosed the problem of, the kind of structural inequalities that may be identified in the refugee regime itself, to what extent are they insulated from wider inequalities in the world? How do you rate those kind of those two processes? Is there a, does one act on wider inequality to change inequality in a narrower sector? Does one start in the narrower sector and hope to effect that despite those wider conditions of inequality? So my three questions, I'm afraid, are probably quite basic ones for somebody like you who's thought a lot about this, but I'd be really keen to get your feedback. And then I can see we've got a lot of questions coming up in the chat for a second round of questions, if you're happy to take those. Over to you, Sana.
Thank you, David. Yeah, lots of questions, and I'm eager to engage with as many as I can. Thank you all for the questions, and thank you, David, for the questions. About the definition of persons of forced displacement, I think that's why I started with if you self-identify. I think that there's so many, it's very important in that it's a self-identification. So it's an identification that you claim versus it's assigned to you. And I give this as a foundation ground of any person when I ask, like, especially like, for example, we're trying to realize refugee leadership internally. So we're hiring, our goal is to hire persons of experience for displacement, because we believe that it's a skill, actually, it's certain expertise that's needed for our job. And so in asking about that, we share how we define it, and then it's really open to people. If you self-identify, then you self-identify. And I think this is very important for a number of reasons to make it self-identify versus an assigned identity, because we've made these mistakes in many other movements. We've been making these mistakes, around who's Black enough, who's brown enough, who is women enough, who is queer enough, and I think no. We have also learned that we don't have the right, as someone who doesn't have this identity or within this movement. And it's really, even as a person of forced displacement, I could be practicing exclusion by myself on my other, other people in the movement by using definitions. And terminology is really dangerous. And that's why I really appreciate always inclusive, flexible definitions and terminologies that are self-claimed. And so you asked about like children of refugees. There are people who in the US who their families fled, came in boats from Vietnam and all over to the US. And someone identified as a person of forced displacement when I was talking to them, and they said they feel like they have lived it secondhand through their parents day to day. Who am I to say no, you're not? So yes, it's a self-identity, it can't be assigned. I hope that answers your question, or that's my point of view. Refugee leadership in local context, absolutely. I think so. Two things. In the past, before joining Asylum Access, many of the refugee leaders they have involved and engaged with in advocacy, they are people who are all over the world, who are local in that sense. Some of us were refugees in global north, others were refugees in global south, but the safest institutions that we were able to engage with were the neutral institutions, like the UN agencies versus like local governments. And that's because of the risk, the legalities, and all of that comes with it. That's not because it doesn't matter. So that's because like there's that concept aspect to it. The other aspect to it is actually there's no mechanisms there's no participation mechanism in local level, like very few participation mechanism on local level versus a global, and they would be limited more to local actors or nationals, I would say. And that's why national actors are very, very important. And there's a question I saw about the chat, like, what do you think is the role for national actors? Like, a huge role. You are positioned. You have positioning and certain access and privilege and role to play that is key for people to realize their rights and to support this movement. And so it's you have to be there. You have to be doing the work you're doing. There's like certain local advocacy. You are the only person who can do it. And so there is an important role for you there, but it's very limited for persons who are there. The other thing I would say, the other barrier for refugee leadership on local level is a lot of the refugee-led organizations are in survival mode. We keep them busy serving their communities with emergency response, literally. And that's because they are deprived from sustainable, impactful funding where they can stop surviving and feel more stable as an organization. Then they can participate in advocacy, because participating in advocacy is seen as a privilege for so many of those refugee-led organizations. And we are keeping them, again, very much in survival mode. So once we give them sustainable funding, and that source participation, and then we have the role of sharing access and providing that access to engage in these global policies or regional or national policies. And then the fourth thing I want to say is that we have launched at Asylum Access, we convened the Resourcing Refugee Leadership Initiative, which I want to, these are sorry, I'm going to put that website here for everyone. And this is a coalition of local refugee-led organizations, 5 of them in Colombia, Uganda, Indonesia, Egypt, and Lebanon. And what we did with that is that we recognize very much is that those who having access to global platforms of persons of forced displacement they have critical role, and it's important. But also, again, there are those who are not having this access, those who have not been speaking English, in the way that I'm speaking right now, those who don't know you and don't know X person to be able to be invited to speak here and all of that. And so we wanted to, and we have important role to play. One of it is to engage with the global level, but also to facilitate access to the global level for those who don't have it. And so that was one of the many reasons we have convened the Resourcing Refugee Leadership Initiative. And these are all, again, local refugee-led organizations. And what we're doing with that is that we're advocating to shift power through we have created a fund. And I saw a question also here in the chat about kind of barriers to receive funding for local organizations. I think the question was like, is the right thing then to give money to the national governments and then they give, to, no, I don't think so. I mean, you should give money to national governments, yes, but not, I would not trust. Do we trust? We don't trust. I would not trust only, any government to really do, I mean, with the best intentions, to be able to give communities who are unregistered. A lot of refugee-led organizations are unregistered or don't have bank accounts or, all different things. They are doing important work for their communities, to give them significant funding. So one stream is, fund national organization. Another stream, yes, we have to fund directly local refugee-led organizations. And in that fund, in this initiative, the Resourcing Refugee Leadership Initiative, which you can learn more on the website, we have created a fund that is registered in the US, yet led by the local refugee-led organizations, that really provides a mechanism to collect donor money and redistribute it through inclusive participatory grant making to the local refugee-led organization. And what the fund does, dismantles all the barriers that a lot of the philanthropic institutions face in sending money to local organizations. The risk that they don't have bank account, they don't have registration, all of that. The fund takes care of all of those things. And so yet you're able, and it goes directly to local refugee-led organizations. So that's kind of on the question of, this is a practical example, this initiative of how you can do it. And then I also mentioned what are the barriers for local participation versus global. The second question about inequities, and kind of that goes to my point about intersectionality. What we do in our movement, in the refugee rights movement, in our sector, is very important in general because I am not only a refugee. I am a person of forced displacement who's also brown, who's also woman, who's also queer, who's also Muslim, who's also Arab. So I'm first, the level of inequities that we face just by existing are intersectional. And so once one of my rights is addressed, it helps in my, when I have the right to work, I'm not working informally, then that's, saving me from facing inequity on one level. And that's of course helping me in speaking, being able to speak up for the other inequities that happen to me. And the list goes on. And that's why I think the intersectionality of our movement is not only important because it's trendy in academia, or it's not only important because we have to learn from what other movements are doing and their tools and lessons learned. No, it's also important because of the impact. It actually has impact on everyone's life in those movements once we address inequities of any in those movements, and we support each other in addressing those inequities. I hope I addressed your question.
Oh, very much so. Very interesting responses. Many thanks indeed, Sana. I can see that we've got questions mounting up. Some of them you've addressed, so I may skip over them, but just taking a few in order if I can. First of all, we've got a question about, $1 million question is how to ensure representation. And I take that to mean, given the diversity of refugee experiences or displaced persons experiences, how do you ensure that representation reflects that diversity? A second question here is, let's see, I think you've probably gone on to that. There's a couple of questions here. I'd like to know your views about what are your expectations from academia, academic research, particularly refugee law research. I think there's a similar one. What would you recommend to academics and researchers on refugee issues in our daily work at a conference like this to be working in allyship with refugee-led movements? And if I can take... So you've got two questions there. And a third one, do you consider Biden administration's appointment of Alejandro Mayorkas, who's a refugee, as Secretary of Homeland Security, as refugee leadership, and your reasons for that? There is a final question here, which I'm interested in how you've used the frame of a movement in the fight for representation. What do you think forms a strong foundation for solidarity in a refugee regime in which different displaced communities with varied causes are often competing for assistance and attention from a global community increasingly hostile to refugees? So I think that's probably a fairly similar question to the representation. So I think probably we've just got enough time, perhaps 10 minutes, if you'd like to address those very deep questions. I'll hand over to you now.
Yes. Thank you all for these questions. I wish we were in person. It would be very nice to engage in a conversation and back and forth on these. But yes, on the question on how do we ensure diversity in representation, first, this question I get asked a lot with all different intentions, I have to say. So I don't know the intention of the person, but I'm going to answer it with both intentions. First is that it's an important question for us to think about, absolutely, in the movement. It's one of the very first questions I was faced in every meeting since in 2016, 2017. And the intention was to question legitimacy. You know, it was to question the legitimacy of me and like any person who's like demanding self-representation. And I, again, not saying this question was asked in that intention. I'm saying this question gets asked sometimes within this intention, because yeah, the first thing is like, but how can we say who represent refugees? And why do you represent refugees and other not? And you know, so the first we jump into questioning the legitimacy of anyone who demands a right before we actually address the right. It's like a defense mechanism. And my question always goes back, well, I'm happy to answer, but have we ever questioned the legitimacy and the representation and diversity of INGOs in the sector? We've never done that. What is your legitimacy in representing me and presenting my rights? And so the argument, you know, makes itself. But I want to answer this question, and I think it is an important question. Personally, I never say I represent a population. I represent what my role in the movement is. I represent myself. I represent my experience. I represent what I understand my definition of the movement is, my role in the movement is. So I don't think I can't represent all, you know, women. I can't represent all. I can represent elements of that experience of being a woman, but I can't speak for a whole thing. And I think it really speaks also to our dire need to just have umbrellas and labels and just one person who just everything. And this is really because we don't want to do the effort of like, oh, can I just bring like few people who are going to be refugees and do the refugee representation, and then we'll be done. And like, can I say that you represent like all of Syrian women? Like, no, you know, but there's a need, like we are used in the sector. And that actually speaks to the question about, I think, where was it? Yeah, maybe the same question about allyship and all of it. We want poster child. We want people who are that. I wanted to speak about this actually in terms of the Biden administration assignment. Great, but not enough. And what does that mean? And who's around them? And like how many people, like what's the structure that's actually enabling them to set the strategy? And is it one person? Is it fair to put the responsibility of representation and for change of years of exclusion on one person? I wouldn't do that. And at first, it's not fair to the person. It's not for the person also to inherit all these problematic structures and have the responsibility to dismantle them because they are the person who have the lived experience of forced displacement. And secondly, it's a great step, but I wouldn't allow anyone to use me, or you know, at least me, I speak about myself, to be like, oh, you see, Sana, like, oh, it could happen. Should we talk about the barriers that it took me to arrive here? Yes, I mean, I guess it could happen, but it's dangerous to use the exception as the rule now in a movement that's very early on, and we're still demanding for rights where there is no actually structures and systems that make sure it could happen not only to Sana, it could happen to so many other people besides Sana. So I think that's what's really dangerous about representation and realizing refugee leadership in that form, is that one person cannot be the answer. And let's challenge ourselves into the need for having one person who represents everyone. And that means, yes, within the refugee experience, within the forced displacement experience, there are so many experiences that we need to give attention to. You know, a person who has experience, who is Black and who's maybe also non-binary, or, you know, a queer person, and who is in Uganda versus Black and queer in US is different. And, you know, both experiences, they have their nuances. And depends on your area of work, all experiences, the relevant experiences should be reflected and should inform your work. So I would say, yes, we should always question more who's not on the table and do our effort, because it's not going to be, you know, we're not going to arrive, never. And that's actually nice, because that means we're always going to be learning, we're always going to be challenged, and that means we're also always going to be growing. And as a result, we'll always be addressing the needs of everyone in the community and making sure that they are part of addressing their own needs. They don't feel excluded. And then there's the question about academia. I think I haven't answered. Recommendations for true allyship. when a lot of people ask me about like, what do you think, like what's true allyship is in the refugee rights movement? Because I see refugee leadership as a right. So refugee rights movement includes all of that. At first, it's really, I feel, especially in global north, in the past 2 years, we have been, I would say, especially in the US, but even I would argue in Europe and other places, we have been finally pushed to question what is our role around racism, in America and Europe, and what is true allyship towards Black communities, brown communities. And I would say this is not much different. Actually, it's really not different. We have learned that we want to question our privilege. We want to watch out our language. We want to focus on the history of what we did to Black communities. We want to fund Black-led organizations and companies and all of that. We want to make sure that they're represented. This is exactly what we're asking here. And this is exactly also the role of academia as well, especially who's writing, who's producing knowledge, and why certain topics are not being produced about. Like when actually I was seeking certain applications and money, and we were trying to build the evidence of why refugee leadership is impactful and it matters. And there's no really academic research around that, not significant at all. So because this has never happened in the past, like it's never been funded in a significant way. Refugees have never been funded as refugees in a significant way where they could show their impact to receive funding. And then also this has not been talked about in academia either. So what we did is that we tapped into other movements, showing that, there's research from other movements that it works. And also like around money, how much money goes, where the money goes, there isn't like much research. So I think these questions, same like any other movement, who's producing the knowledge, what topics we're talking about, what language we're using, how much academia is facilitating access to those also who have experienced forced displacement and have the academic background. They want to be the researcher. They want to be part of that, but they're excluded by all different academic exclusion culture around white dominant profession culture. The way you speak, the way who the academic institution is affiliated with, and all of those things. And I think there's an amazing writer. I would suggest reading her books and following, and she does very much that on academic institution, is Taya Ahmed. She's a feminist writer. Lives in Australia and has been working on academic institution, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and really around self-representation. So I would highly recommend looking at that. And she provides lots of tools for universities to question and to start that journey. And I would invite you, I want to use the platform. Please, no more books on refugees without refugees. Like, it's doable. They exist. We exist. There are so many academic refugee researchers, and they also, that would be, we have to talk about equitable partnership. Even in that initiative, it happens. Lots of people be like that, the main author, and then they bring a refugee researcher and they say, oh, we did that with refugees. This is not meaningful participation. This is not shifting power. Think of it. I think every time you think about, is this meaningful or not? Think about, am I shifting power or not? Am I sharing power at least or not? Yeah, back to you.
Many thanks indeed, Sana. And I can see from some of the questions that have come out that there is a good deal of interest amongst what you've been saying during the course of the presentation, and in fact, particularly from some of the interventions who have identified themselves as refugees, working as scholars or as humanitarian practitioners, etc. So I'm sure that what you've said has given a great deal of food for thought for those who may self-identify as persons of forced displacement or not as well. It's been fantastic to have you here talking with us. You've given us a lot to think about on our last day of the conference, and I'm sure that I join with all of the other people who have participated in this session in wishing you the very best of luck in your work developing refugee leadership through asylum access. Many thanks indeed for joining us, Sana Mustafa, and we really look forward to seeing where your projects take you next. Thank you also for the links you've just posted.
Yeah, no, thank you, David. If I may say, I'm really thankful for creating this space for conversation. And I feel like I want to assure people again is that it's challenging, and it might feel challenging, it might feel difficult, and might feel uncomfortable, but that means that there is something wrong if you feel that way, that's about to change. And so, and you're not alone. Again, reach out to me and to my colleagues in Asylum Access. As individuals and as an institution, we are figuring it out as we go as well. And we have lots of questions. And so we're happy to, have a conversation with anyone who's thinking about those questions. The links are not showing up.
Very quick comment in the chat saying that the links that you're posting are to hosts and panelists, not to everybody. So if you desire to repost those, many thanks indeed. So for other participants, we move swiftly on to our next set of sessions, which will start at 10 past the hour. If you look in the program, you'll find the Zoom links alongside each of those sessions, and we look forward to welcoming you at each of them. They are thematic sessions. There are 3 of them, so you can take your pick. With a final thanks to Sana Mustafa, we will proceed to our next set of panels. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.